Good morning, all. Thank you all for joining the Thought Leadership Forum brought to you by DAYWALK. We're also privileged to have some senior representatives from the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator, NHVR, as well as Main Roads WA. My name is Gary Menzies. I'm Managing Director at DAYWALK. Today's forum is really about unpacking the reality of transport engineering. And you might say, well, what does that really mean in simple terms? It's really those core principles to ensure that loads on the backs of trucks are safe and everyone gets home safely tonight. There'll be 4 brief presentations, and I guess for me and for perhaps each one of us, winning will be that we all take away at least one gem, something perhaps new that we weren't aware of before. And no doubt some of the attendees today have come with a wealth of knowledge already in the space of chain of responsibility. So today's forum might be used simply as sharpening the saw. At the end of the presentations, there will be a Q&A session. And at any stage during the forum presentations, you can click on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen and type a question in there. And the panel at the end of the time will actually seek to answer all questions. There'll also be a feedback form sent out after today's forum, and any feedback that is submitted will give you access to the slide pack. So again, very thankful for any feedback that you do give. And you might say, including in that forum feedback, we'd ask, there might be a topic you'd like to see unpacked at a future forum. It might be specifically chain of responsibility or WHS relating to heavy equipment. So again, thankful and certainly encourage all attendees to submit feedback at the end of the session. Before we actually start on the presentations, we're going to just run a very brief poll. So if we could pull that up, that would be much appreciated. Everyone could just click their answer and submit. It'll just take a few seconds. The question is, how much do you know about chain of responsibility? Give it a few more seconds. All right, that's good. Thank you for all answers there. So there's, you might say, the prevailing answers are enough to get me through and pretty good. We certainly appreciate no one has ticked nothing. That's great. Some feel very little and some are, I'm an expert. So thank you for the input. And with that, we might head on to our presenters. So I'll introduce our first speaker, Jennifer Attili. Jen is based in Queensland. She's worked for the NHVR for something like 8 years. Jen manages the Code of Practice program. She's really an SME, so she's a subject matter expert. In simple terms, she helps explain what chain of responsibility means. So over to you, Jen. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for that introduction, Gary. Now, I think you'd all be well aware how important safe load restraint is in terms of road safety. And as was mentioned in that introductory video, if you caught it, it's an obligation that often falls at the feet of a driver. There are prescriptive requirements in the Heavy Vehicle National Law about safe load restraint, and if there's a failure to comply with the loading performance standards, the driver of a heavy vehicle can be penalised for that failure. However, drivers can only work with the vehicles, the loads and the information and the facilities and the time that's available to them when they are transporting goods. If one of those things is missing or falls short, then it can be difficult for those drivers to ensure compliance with those standards. This is where parties in the chain of responsibility also have a duty to ensure that loads are safely restrained. Chain of responsibility has been a part of Australian road law in most Australian jurisdictions for about 2 decades. The policy foundation of chain responsibility is a realisation that in many cases, the safe use of a heavy vehicle on a road depends on the actions or omissions of off-road parties who have influence or control over the use of that same vehicle. When the Heavy Vehicle National Law commenced in 2014 in all Australian jurisdictions except Western Australia and the Northern Territory, chain responsibility provisions took a particular form. In a nutshell, the way they worked was this, that if a heavy vehicle driver committed certain breaches of the law, then other parties in the chain of responsibility were also deemed to be liable. Later on, when you hear from Mick Wainwright from Main Roads, Western Australia, you'll hear that in Western Australia, the law still takes that same form. However, in participating jurisdictions for the Heavy Vehicle National Law, that's all the eastern states plus South Australia and Tasmania, the law changed in October 2018 when the primary duty was introduced. Since that law was amended, parties in the chain of responsibility now have a duty to ensure the safety of their transport activities so far as reasonably practicable. This form of the law is deliberately modelled on WHS legislation so that businesses can streamline their safety management, taking the same approach to different kinds of hazards and risks. So it's no longer the case that responsibility is triggered only when something goes wrong. Instead, a COR party breaches the duty by failing to have systems in place to prevent things from happening. Could we move to the next slide, please? Now, I hope that these definitions are reasonably familiar to you. I just want to make the point that although the law applies to individuals and to businesses, the focus of the law is really upon businesses. And that's the same as the case for WHS law. And that's because businesses have a greater capacity to put systems in place and to see things through than to individuals. I'm not saying individuals have no responsibility, but when we're talking about a party in the chain responsibility, the first thing we should be talking about is a business or an organisation that's doing something. Just note that those definitions are based on drivers, on vehicles and on goods. And in particular, when we're talking about goods, that means that almost any business in Australia that's sending or receiving goods on heavy vehicles will be a party in the chain of responsibility. I just want you to note the definition of a loading manager. That's a business that owns or manages premises where vehicles are loaded or unloaded every day. For example, a distribution centre or a depot. So all of those businesses are parties in the chain of responsibility, and they all have the same duty, the duty to ensure safety so far as reasonably practicable. Now, there's often a lot of attention and hand-wringing paid to working out which party a business might be, whether it's a consigner or a scheduler. My suggestion to you is to focus on the fact that you are one or more of those parties, rather than being overly concerned with deciding which party you are. And that's because it doesn't matter which party you are. If you are any of those parties, then you have the duty, and the duty is always the same. The duty is to ensure safety. Note as well that you are a party in the chain of responsibility because of what you're actually doing in relation to a heavy vehicle. So you can see there the question is, when is my business a party in the chain of responsibility? So it doesn't depend on a title or a name, it depends on the function that's actually being performed at the time. May we go to the next slide, please? Now here you'll see a statement of the duty as it appears in the law, that's section 26C. Just a few words on some of those terms. The definition of safety is the definition that you might think. So protecting people on the road, including drivers. It also extends to protecting vehicles and loads. it includes protection of road infrastructure and protection of the environment. But when we're talking about load restraint, of course, the focus is on the safety of vehicle drivers and passengers, not only heavy vehicles, but all road users. The next term that you might need to understand is this term, so far as reasonably practicable. If you're already aware of your WHS duties, you should be familiar with this term. The term's defined in the Heavy Vehicle National Law in identical terms to the definition in the Work Health and Safety Law. To put it in simple terms, this is a requirement to do what is proportionate to risk. So it's a requirement to assess the risk that's involved in a particular activity, and then to take measures that are proportionate to that risk. It's a standard that's judged objectively. So it's not a question of what you personally think is proportionate. It's a question of what a reasonable observer with all the information would think is proportionate. And of course, when we're talking about heavy vehicles transporting large objects, I don't think you need to be told that the potential risk is very high. So in ordinary terms, there would be an expectation of the public that businesses go to a substantial amount of trouble to make sure that loads are safely secured. Now, and finally, sorry, the third term that's defined there is this concept of transport activities. Now, the law gives a range of examples of things that would fall within the definition, but the definition is an inclusive definition. So that means that all of those examples are part of the definition, but so is anything else that falls into the general definition of activity that's related to the use of a heavy vehicle on a road. So that would incorporate the whole gamut of things that your business does that's related to heavy vehicle use. So if you're a transport company, for example, it includes the way you recruit and train your staff, the way you schedule maintenance of vehicles, the way routes are chosen for delivery of goods. If you're a consignor or a consignee, it's also about the information that you provide to a transport company, the feedback that you provide, and also the way you negotiate and communicate with them before, during, and after the transport of the goods. It also includes explicitly what's called business practices and decision making. So that includes WHS procedures, safety instruction, and even the way your board of directors monitors the way your business operates and the way it responds to information about safety. How to comply with the primary duty. It's similar to the way you'd comply with your work health and safety duty. You identify hazards and risks, and you find methods or measures to control them that are reasonably practicable. And those measures will usually be a combination of equipment, training, procedures, and information. And particularly when we're talking about load restraint, we're talking about exchange of information between business partners. Next slide, please. A key principle of the primary duty is this idea that safety is a shared responsibility. I think this is a unique feature of the Heavy Vehicle National Law. For example, it's not found explicitly in the model WHS laws. Section 26A states this quite plainly, and then it goes on to itemise some of the factors that come into play when we determine the nature of each party's, the level and nature of each party's responsibility. In other words, each party has to share in the responsibility, but what each of them has to do to discharge that duty is going to be different. That's because each of them has a different degree of influence or control on the safety of the transport task. The next key principle is this idea that although the duty is shared, it's not diminished. So it's not a case of, well, there's three parties, each of us has a third of a duty. What can often happen, in fact, is that there may be a double up and that there might be redundancy built into the system. So each party is doing their part, doing what's reasonably practical from their point of view based on what they can contribute. with the outcome that you have a total system that is designed to ensure safety. Next slide, please. So that means that different businesses will have different ways of working together to ensure that loads are safely restrained. Some of those controls are things that will happen well before a load is transported. For example, doing research about the best way to restrain or to secure a load onto a pallet, liaising with a business partner about the best procedure that might be used. Some of the controls will happen shortly before or at the time of transport. For example, providing accurate information about the mass and dimensions of a load, scheduling when a vehicle will arrive at premises, making sure that the right staff and equipment are available when a load is to be restrained, and then of course securing lashings and checking them before and during the transport. Some of the control measures will be happening afterwards, for example, providing feedback or reporting on a particular load and its restraint to make sure that it was working well. And some of the other control measures are things that are taking place all the time. For example, training your employees, inspecting the lashing attachment points on your vehicles, having a schedule to regularly inspect and replace the lashings that are used by your transport company. So those are happening at different times. And you can see there in the diagram, I've also highlighted that there's control measures that are occurring in different places by different businesses. For example, making sure that when a trip is scheduled, that there's enough time so that even so that the properly trained, properly equipped employees have enough time to make sure that a load is properly restrained, making sure that the right equipment is available to them, and making sure that there's procedures in place that people are aware of and escalation pathways when something goes wrong. So it's those kind of controls, and each of you, knowing your own business, will be best placed to work out how you can contribute and come up with a system where it's a combination of those different control measures that results in the safety outcome and results in your business's compliance with its primary duty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Certainly appreciate the insights you've shared. And just to remind all attendees, use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen to type any questions that you'd like answered at the end. Before we hand over to our second speaker, we're just going to run another very quick poll. So if you can type your answer, choose the box that's most relevant. We'll pull that up now. Another few seconds and we'll pull up the answer, the poll outcome. It looks like WA has got a 39, Queensland a 36, New South Wales 13, South Australia and Tas. Vic, thank you for that. All right, without further ado, we'd like to introduce our second speaker, Mick Wainwright. Mick is based in Western Australia. He's the Acting Manager, Heavy Vehicles, Transport Compliance in Western Australia. He's been with Main Roads for approximately 20 years. He was an inspector on the roads, and now he looks after all heavy vehicle compliance on behalf of Main Roads WA. So warm welcome to you. Mick, take it away.
Good morning, and thank you for attending the information session. As Gary said, I'm from Main Roads WA, and I'll be talking about the major differences between the NHVR chain of responsibility and West Australia chain of responsibility. West Australian law was based on the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator law, and so there are very similar in a lot of ways. We did not, or ours has not been amended to follow the NHVR down the WHS track. So we are still with the original laws we started with. One of the first major differences is that the NHVR chain of responsibility is only for vehicles above 4.5 tonne, but in WA it's for all vehicles. Therefore, if you are towing a trailer to the tip on the weekend in your own car, then you must operate in accordance with the legislation. And this has a flow-on effect to Western Australia, as there is no need for us to have separate legislation in regards to loading for light vehicles. Next. Chain of Responsibility WA covers all mass, dimension and load restraint offences, MDLR as we call them for short. Main roads transport wardens and police are the enforcement agencies for WA for chain of responsibility. Next. So the major differences are fatigue is a major difference. In WA, fatigue is included in the Work, Health and Safety General Regulations 2022 and not in C of R. Main roads wardens actually have no power in regards to fatigue. This is being reviewed at this time. Operators from other states are required to operate under WA requirements while in the state. There are certain exceptions to that, but basically they have to operate under the WA law. And if operating under the national law, they generally will be operating within our requirements anyway. There's just a couple of little differences. Western Australian heavy vehicle accreditation is mandatory in Western Australia for any operator wishing to operate a RAV or a restricted access vehicle. And a restricted access vehicle is a vehicle that is wider than 2.5 metres, longer than 19 metres, higher than 4.3, and has a mass greater than 42.5 tonne. And also we accredit the operator who must show that they have systems in place to manage maintenance, fatigue. Main roads inspectors have authority to check the fatigue management of accredited operators, and dimension and loading. Must show they have controls in place to control the loading of the vehicles and the roads that they're accessing. Now, NHVR accreditation is not mandatory and they accredit the vehicle. So there's a major change in that area. WA legislation refers to the Load Restraint Guide 2004, whereas the NHV has adopted the 2018 guide. They're very similar, and if you are using the 2018 guide, you will conform to the WA requirements. Persons in the chain are more defined within the NHVR, especially under the new legislation. In ours, it includes the consignor, who is the commissioning of carrying of the goods, the packer, placing goods in packages, containers, or on pallets, the loader, placing or restraining the load on the vehicle, driver or co-driver, operator controls the use of the vehicle, the consignee receiving the load, and any person who threatens, intimidates, coerces, includes, or offers an incentive to another person to commit an offence. Permits are issued by Main Roads WA, and there is no requirement for an operator to get approval from the local government to access the roads. It is also important to remember that interstate operators must obtain a WA permit to operate in WA. NHVR permits have no access powers in Western Australia. Next. Within our legislation, there is also a reasonable steps defence. And that reasonable steps, the onus of proof is actually on you as the defendant, for want of a better word, to prove that you took all reasonable steps. It's not up to the prosecutor to prove that. So you must know, did you know of the breach, and could not reasonably expected to have known of the breach, and took all reasonable steps to prevent the breach, or no steps that could reasonably have been taken to prevent the breach. Very hard to prove that you took reasonable steps if the breach was known. So the first dot points must be in play. So you must have either did not know of the breach or could not reasonably have been expected to know. And then it's either dot point 3 or 4. So it's all those have to be in play for you to get that reasonable steps defence. Next. Okay, just a demonstration of some of the thinking around loading out on that we've come across from time to time. This one has a bit of a problem with distribution of weight, apart from the fact that the GVM and GCM for the vehicle would be exceeded. The load restraint has, and load restraint has a requirement to regard stability and distribution. The only advantage this person had was he was getting very, very good wear out of his steer tyres, and was quite happy with that sort of that outcome. One strap to secure the load and only pulling back, nothing from the side movement or downward force. Rear overhang is exceeded, and as I said, the other aspect would be the anchor point for the tie downs would not be suitable either. And as I said, he was quite happy with the steer tyre. The driver felt that the steering was nice and light and didn't have too many issues with it. Next. This has been a restraint. This has been restrained, but not correctly. Has created another offence simply because the load has moved because of the restraint method was not correct. The vehicle is now oversized and would now require a permit. But his other issue is that we wouldn't issue him a permit because the load is not in its smallest configuration it can be. So the only thing they can do is adjust the load and put it back in gauge and restrain it correctly. It's important that when we restrain a load, we ensure that it can't move, not just fall off. It is imperative that you ensure all components and movable parts of a load are secured, including any manufacturer's instructions pertaining to the transport of the equipment. So if you've got things that can move on that load, you must make sure they're secured, as the manufacturer has usually put in their operating guide on the movement of those vehicles. Next. Any questions, please fill out the Q&A section and we'll respond at the end.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Mick. That was certainly very insightful and excellent to get that, you might say, those nuances between Main Roads WA and HVR. Certainly appreciate what you've shared. And thank you for the Q&A starting. Any questions, please type that in. We'll attend to that at the end. Without further ado, we'll introduce our third speaker. That's Tim Brown. Tim is based in New South Wales. He's had 25+ years experience in compliance. 10 of those years have been on-road experience and 15 years in training. So Tim has been working with the regulator since 2015 while at Transport New South Wales. In the last 12 months, he's transitioned to the regulator and he heads up the load restraint work program. So with that, we introduce Tim Brown. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary, Jennifer and Mick. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to talk to you today. If I could just ask you one question, can you show me if your load complies? Would you be able to do that? In other words, what preparation has the company done to ensure compliance with the loading requirements? It's surprising how many drivers I talk to that cannot answer this question. And if the driver can't, how can the employer or any other parties in the chain of responsibility? Next slide, please. So who must comply with the Heavy Vehicle National Law, or the HVNL? So vehicles over 4.5 tonnes gross vehicle mass, and they also have to be heavy vehicles operating in the NHVR jurisdictions. Jennifer mentioned those earlier on. This also includes vehicles visiting from Western Australia and the Northern Territory. So if you come into our jurisdictions, you need to comply with our requirements. Thank you. Next slide, please. The loading requirements really come down to three fundamentals. A load must not be placed in a way that makes a vehicle unstable or unsafe. 2, it must be secured, so it's unlikely to fall or be dislodged from the vehicle. And 3, it must be restrained using an appropriate method that meets the loading requirements. Next slide, please. This picture from the 2018 Load Restraint Guide, and there's a similar picture in the 2004 guide as well, shows the forces that the load restraint system must comply with. The forces listed in this picture have been designed by engineers to ensure the load on or in a vehicle will not become dislodged from that vehicle under expected normal driving conditions, including hard deceleration. As braking can produce higher forces than other directions, the forward restraint must meet 0.8 or 8.8 G or 80% of the weight of the load. The sideways restraint and the rearwards restraint system must meet 0.5 G or 50% of the weight of the load, and the vertical restraint system must meet 0.2 or 20% of the weight of the load. These figures might not mean a lot to you, but the Load Restraint Guide has examples and tables to help you understand and comply with the loading requirements. Next slide, please. This slide is an example of a 10-ton load and how the 0.8, 0.5 and 0.2 are calculated in relation to the weight of the load. So you can see there at the front, the load weighs 10 tonnes, so our restraint system has to restrain 8 tonne worth of load. So when we're thinking about how many lashings we need to do the calculations to restrain 8 tonne. And the same sideways is 5 tonne worth of restraint worth of load, and same for rearwards, and 0.2 for the vertical. Next slide, please. The 2018 Load Restraint Guide has 12 case studies or examples where it walks you through various load types and the methods and shows you how to calculate the restraint required. I advise anyone that's doing anything to do with load restraint to please look at those examples, find the one that best suits you, and follow the instructions. Next slide, please. This is a picture of a hydraulic cylinder that broke through the front of a timber box it was in. The box itself was restrained pretty well, but not the cylinder inside the box. Lucky for the driver, it was just touching the headboard, and luckily it also wasn't involved in some sort of major accident, because I don't think the headboard would have stopped that cylinder going through and piercing the back of the cab. A little bit hard to see in this picture, but this is a picture of some trailer axles restrained to a timber pallet. The pallets are broken either from being a poor quality or the weight of the axles themselves. Either way, they are no longer providing adequate restraint. And you can see the bits of the timber there starting to fall away. It's a bit hard to see in this picture as well, but this is a picture of a steel press that was not restrained properly and fell from the vehicle. It weighed around 1,800 kilograms, and it was lucky it did not hurt anybody. Just closing the side curtain does not make the problem go away, and this particular item was just placed inside a Pantech truck, sat on the deck, and they just closed the side curtains and hoped that it would make it to the end, and it didn't. That concludes my presentation, and I hope you took something away from my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. Certainly the case studies make it very real, and I think we appreciate the effort that you've put in there. So thank you for that. Before we move on to our fourth and final presenter, I'd like to just take the liberty of introducing one of the panelists, Peter Rouse. Peter, you there?
I'm here now.
Very good. Thank you, Pete. So I thought it would just be good to introduce Peter to the attendees as well. Peter is based in Queensland. He spent something like 20 years with RTA and RMS. He was seconded up to the regulator office in 2012. Peter has worked in various roles with regulatory compliance. He's now managing the standards and advice team. So Peter, big shout out to you and to the NHVR team for coming on today. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our fourth speaker, Mr. Samuel Poikael. Sam is based in Queensland. As a member of Engineers Australia, Sam is a chartered professional engineer, part of National Engineers Register in Australia. He's also an international professional engineer, certified with the APEC, and APEC stands for Asia Pacific Economic Corporation. Sam is engineering manager at DAYWALK. So Sam, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary, for your warm words, and a special warm welcome to all of you who have taken the time out for this meeting. If you've just joined in, we've had our excellent COR panelists, Jen, Mick, and Tim, who've covered interesting perspectives in real-life applications. In the next segment, I will briefly cover an overview on the use or the legends of timber pallets. Next, please. So timber pallets are the most commonly used cradle or system of use for handling a variety of loads. In Australia, as specified by the AS 4068, it has a size of a square of 1165 or a square of 1100. And these sizes are not standard outside Australia. But let's look at some of the key advantages of using timber pallets. Timber pallets are economical as they are the most cost-effective solution as compared to steel or plastic. They are versatile, they're flexible for multiple applications, really low maintenance. As long as you keep moisture and dust away, they are pretty good to use. They're easy to repair. You can easily replace a broken timber, or you can hammer it back into place if it's just peeling it off. And another key advantage is it naturally has a good friction, which is key for load restraint. Let's also look on the flip side of the same coin as its disadvantages. Timber pallets, being a natural product, play a host for bacteria, mold, plants, or fungus when it's damp. It increases the fire hazard presence just being there, although we do prefer having some timber pallets when we go camping. It's not always good in storage. It's a natural product which can absorb liquids and change its properties and lose its ratings. It can lose its ratings even while in storage, but I can cover that in the next slide. And the nails of the edge boards may also damage the product. As you can see, if they protrude out, they provide a sharp, rusty point, which is hazardous for human as well as items which are stored. And timber pallets need replacements for prolonged use. So let me throw some more light back on the rating of timber pallets. Next slide, please. Yep. So timber pallets are defined by the Australian standard 4068 to have a 2-ton load capacity. And what you see on the right is a snip of the actual standard. Now, what you can see defined in the standard is it's defined to be used with slings, it's defined to be used with forklifts, it's defined to be used during load applications, but does not talk about the transport performance standards. Now, another point to note is the highlighted point of note 1 in the standard, which states that longer-term storage will reduce the load capacity on its own. So this is a default derating of a natural product, and it's not intentional or deliberate. There are safeties in place, but over long-time use, it still gets derated. I'm going to look at some more considerations in the next few slides. Let's take a case example where the restraint calculations have been done. You've calculated the right number of straps required to hold an item down to a pallet. But if the edge boards were to fail, essentially the straps lose all its rating, and it's as good as the item laying straight on top of the pallet without any restraint. Next, please. If there are insufficient friction calculations or insufficient restraints, the items themselves can move. And as you can see in the image showed, they result in a high stress point by the restraint systems or by the straps, which can derate the existing pallet or even potentially damage the pallet in application. Next, please. Timber pallets are not predominantly good for concentrated loads or point loads, As you can see in the image, if the load were to be concentrated, albeit be less than 2 tons, even in storage, they can cause damage to the timber boards themselves, which makes timber not an ideal solution for this case. Another one is, say you had a stable structure, say you had a stable restraint, but if the pallets were unstable or they were worn out in storage or even in the previous application, this can result potentially in a pallet failure in the use of these timber pallets. So, next slide, please. The reason I'm showing all of these is just to bring about a few thought points. And we all love our timber pallets and we use them for many applications, but we got to ask ourselves the question, how do I know my timber pallet is still rated? Is a visual inspection still enough? Or how long has the timber pallet being used? Is it time for me to derate the pallet? Or if I replace one or few of the broken boards on top of the timber pallet, how does it affect the entire rating of the pallet? Does it reset its rating or does it get higher? How do I check if my pallets have been exposed to water, moisture, humidity excessively? As timber is a natural product, it can absorb all of it. Or how do I determine, now having an entire array or an entire batch of timber pallets used in a cycle, how do I know what's a batch sample size that I can test for? And that's not really an easy thing to do, as every pallet will depend on the position it's been placed, the environments it's been exposed to, and all the applications that has been gone through, the restraint force. And there are many considerations to be taken into place when you're trying to look into using the timber pallets. And the fact remains that a restraint system is as strong as its weakest member. So you could have the best restraint, the latest chains, the latest hooks, the most effective calculations to hold your product down, but it is as strong as the weakest member used in the system. Next slide, please. So in short, the reason I was bringing these slides to your notice is to ask this question: are the timber pallets the right application for my need? Does timber pallets have a place in this market? Yes, it does. I'm not shooting down the application, but we have to verify if timber pallets is the right application for our use. Now, let's look to a few case studies in the next slides. And one of the most common predominant use of timber pallets, or the advantage, is timber pallets are flexible. I can put a variety of items onto it. Well, yes, that's true. But as long as they're compliant, as long as they're able to withstand the forces, that is a good way to use it. If not, you may end up with a situation which is not really favorable. Next one, please. Cylinders are the favorite for timber pallets because they have a natural rut, or the space between the top boards, which tend to provide some support to prevent items from rolling off. And as Tim has explained in the previous session, he spoke about the transport forces going sideways. Is that rut good enough to hold half the weight trying to roll the item above or below or away from the pallet? Is it meeting the performance standards? Yes, you may be able to strap it down. And another example which Tim had pulled out was the spearing effect, the very fact that the items can still move forward even if you try to prevent it from rolling off. Say the barrel could be restrained properly, but the piston of a hydraulic system can still move forward. Have you considered all the aspects of movement, and have you restrained them all? Next, please. Yes, timber pallets are easily restrainable. We love to use the edge boards to strap items down to it. But what happens when one edge board goes off? The first thing we do is we use the next edge board to strap an item down onto it. But how do we know, or how long will the second edge board last? How far can I push the application of that pallet as compared to a dependable system for restraint? Next, please. And this is one of the more common incidents that we keep hearing. That's the way it came. And usually when an item comes packaged, it's gone by different modes of transport, be by air, by sea, by rail. But how do you know that the standards that were used, or the the forces or the timber that was used can withstand the performance standard for what it's going to be used next. And that goes the other way around as well. For a product used on road, cannot be directly used on rail because it has to meet additional performance standards based on the mode of transport. Next, please. And we all have this, I like to officially call them the pallet whisperers that we have at our workplace. They look at the pallet and they look at the job and they say, this pallet's going to work, or this pallet's not going to work. And the moment the pallet starts failing, what do? We overstrap onto the existing part of the pallet, which still survives. That's usually not a good case because that increases the load on the good part of the pallet, which usually does not make the solution any better as compared to a better or a flexible system which can take its place. Next, please. As a last case study, it's just the item, it's just a question to say, can you restrain an item to a timber pallet? Maybe yes, but can you continue to restrain the item from the timber pallet to the deck of the truck? You have to consider the additional forces which come in chaining an item down to the deck of a truck. And the simplest way that I ask or I tell people is, do you feel yourself comfortable if you are driving a brand new convertible right next to a truck carrying these items, going at 100 kilometers and it's going around a bend? How confident would you be to maintain your position with respect to the truck and continue that bend? If you have questions, I'm sure everyone on the road has questions. So it's not that timber pallets are the wrong application. They're not supposed to be used in our market, but are timber pallets the right application for my need? And that's a question I'm going to leave you with. Thank you, Gary. That's it for me. And just a reminder to the team, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A tab. Back to you, Gary.
Thank you, Sam, and appreciate the insights and examples, case studies that you've shared, and really that question that's asked, is timber applicable? Is it appropriate to my need? Interestingly enough, DAYWALK is working with industry as we speak, you might say real time, on a new product called the Zyphos, which is a sustainable, a safe, and a reusable alternative to timber pallets. So more to come on that. I think there might be some more information available when you submit feedback on that specific product too. So I guess if I just put myself in the shoes of an attendee today, one of the questions that I've, I guess, come away with is today's forum really to say that every single frame or platform or pallet you use for the transport of heavy equipment, does it have to be engineered? And I would say, no, we're not saying that. What we are saying is that one of the ways you can demonstrate that you are compliant is by having a system that is tested and certified to the loading performance standards. So before we move to the Q&A slot, we'd just like to do one final poll. If we could just get the attendees to share their insights again. So how much did you learn about COR today? Just give a few seconds to answer that. It's been great participation. Thank you, all attendees. We'll wait for the results to pop up. That's great. So we've got a fair bit that's certainly come in first, 54%. Some got loads, that's excellent, and then thereafter. So again, thank you for attending, and we'll move quickly onto the Q&A section. There's been a number of questions come in. The first question, which I might hand over to Mick, is please provide clarity why fatigue is not included in WA. Mick, would you be able to start us off there?
Thanks, Gary. The main reason that it wasn't brought across was that it was felt that it was better suited to stay within the occupational safety and health realm, that it was the requirements and the responsibilities were well outlaid in that, and it was decided to leave it within that realm. As I said, we are at the moment in negotiation with WorkSafe to my inspectors to be given powers as restricted inspectors to look after the fatigue management side of things as well. So we are taking steps in that direction.
Thank you, Mick. Question 2, which I might handball to Jen. Does HVNL, so Heavy Vehicle National Law requirements, come into effect after 4.5 GVM, or does it apply to utes?
No, the Heavy Vehicle National Law only applies in respect of a heavy vehicle with GVM over 4.5 tonnes. So if your ute is 4.5 or less, the Heavy Vehicle National Law does not apply to you. But there are, of course, in each state, there's also load restraint requirements for light vehicles as well, which are very similar to the loading performance standards for heavy vehicles.
That's fantastic. And thank you, Jen, that helps. And as you said, Mick, in Main Roads WA, that's obviously one of the specific differences. If it's a ute, it absolutely does still apply in that, might say, load restraint area. Is that correct, Mick?
Yeah, that's correct. It's for all vehicles, no matter what the weight.
Fantastic.
Including caravans and trailers and those sort of things.
Thank you very much. Question 3, I might actually engage you, Peter. So question 3 is, will there be a push, please, by our regulators to eventually align all heavy vehicle regulations throughout Australia, one set of regulations nationally with the same application of compliances and penalties? Good question. Over to you, Peter.
Yeah, that is a very good question. And the simple answer is, I think that discussion is been happening for a number of years at a very high level, and they're trying to work towards that. But I suppose from an operational point of view, what I suppose is, or the industry can take out of the development of our operational procedures is that WA and Northern Territory have been involved from the inset on 2012 in the development of the on-road procedures for our inspectors or our on-road staff. So what they do on the road, we've sort of agreed to how we do it, and we try to act, I suppose, in the same way and apply, although the regulations are different, but apply the same principles, and we use the same type of approach. The NHVR works regularly with WA Inspectorate, so that transfer of knowledge and I suppose work practices is still ongoing today. So from an operational level, we are trying to obtain some consistency in how heavy vehicles are treated at the roadside, but from a strictly law perspective, no, that's still a work in progress.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that, Peter. Jen, please jump in.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Gary. I was just going to say that the decision to be part of the Heavy Vehicle National Law is the decision that each state has to make itself. So it's not a Commonwealth law. It's a law brought about by an agreement between each of the states to all have the same laws in their respective jurisdictions. So if WA and the Northern Territory want to be part of the Heavy Vehicle National Law, then they can. And as Peter said, we encourage that, but it's up to those jurisdictions to make that decision.
That's fantastic, Jen. The next question, I think I might get Tim to jump in here. So there was just specifically a question about a line pull of X ton, or do you need to determine what your horizontal or vertical restraint force is? Tim, you might be able to help us here.
Yeah, sure. I suppose that question was in relation to one of the slides. I'm guessing the one that I had, the 0.8, the 0.5 and the 0.2. The thing to remember is there's different types of restraint method. The two main ones are tie down and direct restraint. In tie down, we are trying to use the lashings to pull the load down to the deck to increase the friction or the clamping force. And that is very dependent on the angle of the strap. So or the lashing that you might be using. So a lashing may give you a pre-tension of say 600 kilograms, but that will actually be diminished as the angle gets greater and greater. So that will change that calculation. And also in direct restraint, If you had direct restraint being another particular method where you attach a chain directly to an object or a lashing and pull it back at an angle to prevent it, say, moving forwards. Now that is also dependent on that angle, and the further that angle is tilted away from the straight forwards and backwards line of the vehicle for front to back restraint and sideways restraint, the more you go away from those angles, that calculation varies as well. There are tables in the load restraint guide to help you with those calculations in the back. There are several different tables for tie down, and there's also tables in there for direct restraint. And there's also case studies as well that will help you with both of those calculations. So I hope that helps.
Thank you, Tim. It does. And just to confirm, you've said before, I've heard you saying it, those case studies are very graphic and helpful. There's a number of case studies in the load restraint guide, isn't there?
There is, and if you look at, say, the direct restraint, it'll talk about restraining heavy machinery, and a single chain in one direction will get 3.8 ton braking capacity. I think that's 8 mil chain, but that will depend on a lot of factors. So the 3.8 ton is the maximum that you may get, but if it's going over, say, a sharp edge, you downgrade that by 25%. And again, depending on the angles that you use, that 3.8 will get lesser as well. So you really need to do some calculations.
That's excellent. And just another item which might be common knowledge, but in case it's not, the load restraint guide can be downloaded for free. Is that correct, Tim?
Correct. You can download that from our website, from the National Heavy Vehicle Regulators website. It's also available on the NTC and many other jurisdictions. Governments have it on their site as well for a free download. There is a heavy vehicle version and there is a light vehicle version. The NHVR has been given ownership of the heavy vehicle version, and that'll be ours to maintain going forwards.
That's excellent. And while you've got the talking stick, Tim, I might just handball this question to you as well. So the question is, our company has many varied size and shaped loads. We regularly use engineered transport frames that are specifically designed for our products. We hear a lot regarding certification of frames. Is it a legal requirement to have all frames certified, or when is certification required, as most of our engineered frames are from overseas?
Look, great question. I suppose it comes down to managing your risks, and what are the hazards associated with that as well. So if I've got a frame that has not been tested, how do I know that the restraint method is actually going to hold that load? Just like Sam was talking about, if you go around a corner, you don't want that 8-10 ton load coming off. So I suppose the thing is, what calculations or what have you done to reassure yourself that that device that you're using is capable to withstand those forces? So certification is one way. Testing them to meet the performance standards is another way. Getting an engineer in to do that as well. I don't want to just say, yes, absolutely everything has to be certified, but you need to be able to demonstrate that the loading method you're using will meet the performance standards.
That's good. And I might just, there's another question which really, I guess, complements or confirms this, and I might just jump to that one. Another question is, so engineering is not compulsory by law, ? But how could you demonstrate that it is safe then? Thanks. And I guess this is just to endorse or confirm what we said earlier. It's not saying that you might say the law says it has to be a certified frame, but this is a really important part, because how can you confirm, how can you prove that it is safe? So Peter, I might just hand that one across to you. If you'd like to add to that at all. It's a challenge. I guess it's giving that assurance by getting it certified. But what do you say, Peter?
Yeah, look, the load restraint guide provides a myriad of circumstances for particular freight types that, if followed, would demonstrate compliance. So we look at best practice methods. So if you can, determine best practice to restrain or transport a certain commodity or a piece of machinery or an item, that in itself would go a long way to confirming the method you're using is appropriate. And if you follow, instructions or, I suppose, some of the detail in those provided examples, you will more than likely comply. When you step outside of that, or when you are confronted with a different situation, that's when, like as Tim would said, you would start to ask yourself questions. Well, how does this affect what I'm transporting? What assurances, what things do I need to do to provide myself assurances that, yeah, what I'm using is a good method to restrain and it is in fact compliant and safe. I hope that gives some sort of clarity on it.
That's good. Thank you, Peter. Sam, here's one for you. I see many timber pallets fail. Is there any standards around using timber pallets and having the load supported correctly? What do you say there, Sam?
Thank you, Gary. That's quite of a curved ball, to say the least. Now, in an ideal world, let me start with that. If we are able to monitor the life of our pallets, we're able to monitor the environments where the pallets are. We are able to monitor the loads where the pallets, the timber pallets specifically, are being used to. And we're able to predict the natural reaction of the timber based off its categorization or its class. It still is difficult. That goes to prove how much more difficult it is in reality. Now, timber being a natural product can absorb moisture, can absorb water, can absorb a lot of elements out there, which can cause its derating. And so it's difficult for a standard to specify how do you use a timber pallet safely. And just to note as well, timber pallets were and still are the most economical, and they are the base level of a pallet or a cradle that you can use. It's more or less designed as a general application more than a specific case. So it's hard to cover all the cases in a specific standard. Probably one way is if you've got a pallet whisperer with you in your workplace, keep him. He knows what he's talking about. But in reality, there is no direct application. You'll have to consider factors of safety, the amount of loading you can put on it, and figure out a way to use it safely.
Thank you very much, Sam. The final question for today's forum, and we certainly appreciate everyone's input and staying on. There's been a lot of interaction, so thank you. Final question is, does a driver need to check how an item is restrained within a fully enclosed wooden case prior to loading his truck? Now, before I hand this over to Tim, who I think will answer this well, I'd like to just say, with the experience that I've had over many years, I would say in capitals, underlined in bold, yes. Sometimes it can be, you might say, the worst situations are inside a timber box or some sort of chipboard crate, and it only, you might say, exhibits how dangerous it is on the back blocks of Beyond when it's heading up to the Pilbara or heading up to Mackay or wherever it's going. It's frightening seeing the lack of restraint inside some timber boxes. Tim, what would you say?
Look, absolutely. One of the things for this, this sort of goes with Jen's presentation earlier on. If a driver's done all that he can possibly do, say that cylinder, he's picked that cylinder up inside that timber box, he's unable to check really whether it's been restrained inside the box, if he's unable to open it to physically have a look at it. So he'll do his best to restrain the box. And this is where the responsibility would then go to the packer. So the person actually put it inside the box. If we were to stop this person for enforcement on the side of the road, we would look at the most appropriate party that would be responsible for that type of load and that type of breach. So we would consider the driver is unable to really do much about that type of load, and the same would go for probably shipping containers as well. And even loads that have got locks or seals on the side, the driver is unable to open most of those and is not allowed to. Therefore, he just drives the vehicle and hopes that everything inside is restrained. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it's good. That's good clarification. So really what you're saying is perhaps the driver can't verify, but you might say back on the consignor, back on the loader, what's happened? Has there been that duty of care before it was loaded?
Absolutely. I mean, the driver's able to say, Okay, what is the weight of the item inside the load? Hopefully he's got some sort of manifest, and the manifest says that I've got a 1 ton load, and he works out his restraint using the tables in the load restraint guide, and he puts his straps on there, as that person did in that picture earlier on. He's done the best that he can possibly do to restrain that load. And then unfortunately the load busts through the front of the timber casing. We certainly wouldn't be going the driver in that situation.
Thank you very much. Well, to all attendees and certainly all panelists, thank you for your time today. We will send out a feedback form. If there's any further input you'd like to give, we'd certainly be very receptive to receiving it, including topics for future forums. Certainly be glad to get that from you as well. So thank you. And there will be a slide pack made available to all attendees that submit feedback. So thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are.